we actually need to eat in to our remaining ecological budget, because we have to use some of it up, building the infrastructure that we need to have in place in order to move to a sustainable economy. Windmills and solar panels don't come from nowhere. They have to be manufactured. And that involves using resources today. But none of this is limited by our ability to pay for it. The money is not the issue. It's the real resources that are the issue. And of course, those real resources include, most importantly, the ecological resources on which we depend.
Hello and welcome to Planet Critical, the podcast for a world in crisis. My name is Rachel Donald. I'm a climate corruption journalist and your host. Every week I interview experts who are battling to save our planet. My guests are scientists, politicians, academics, journalists and activists. They explain the complexities of the energy, economic, political and cultural crises we face today, revealing what's really going on and what they think needs to be done. These are the stories of the big picture. Go to planetcritical.com to learn more and subscribe. My guest this week is Stephen Hale. Stephen is an economist and a lecturer at Modern Money Lab, the first and only department in the world offering master's courses based around modern monetary theory, or MMT as it's known. Stephen joins me to explain MMT, how the typical understanding of our monetary system, including spending taxpayers' money, running deficits, and currency issuance, are very, very far from the reality of our monetary systems around the world for nations that issue their own currency. Stephen begins by explaining some of the myths peddled by economists and politicians alike, such as we can't afford a green transition, or we can't tax billionaires, or we can't shut that coal mine down because we can't lose its revenue. He explains that nations that issue their own currency, like the US, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, China, have a monetary sovereignty that allows them not just to run a deficit, but means that they should be in deficit in order to secure the private sector. He explains how our taxes are not being spent, but rather currency that is collected as tax is destroyed. That's a better way to think of it. He explains how taxes were used to initially rope people into monetary systems, that governments need us to need their currency rather than needing our money. He explains the relationship between currencies, prices, and inflation with regards to current monetary policy and a green transition. He explains how developing nations are roped into depending on foreign currencies, the impact that has on their development, on their own sovereignty, be it energy, food, or monetary. He anchors MMT in an understanding of real resources, i.e. materials, skills, labour, and explains that if governments want to spend, as we saw during the pandemic, all they have to do is pass bills through Parliament. I hope you all enjoy the episode. If you do, please share it far and wide. And if you're loving the show, become a patron on Patreon or support Planet Critical with a paid subscription at planetcritical.com. By signing up, you'll get the Planet Critical newsletter inspired by each episode delivered straight to your inbox every week. You'll also have access to the wonderful Planet Critical community who are full of inspiring thoughts, ideas, critiques, and determination. The links are in the description box below. I'm so grateful to everyone who chooses to support the project. I'm a vehement believer in ad-free and open access content, so Planet Critical wouldn't exist without the direct support of the amazing community. Thank you so much to all of you who believe in Planet Critical and keep the project going every week. Thank you very much for joining me on Planet Critical. It's a pleasure to have you on the show.
It's a pleasure to be on, Rachel. Thanks for asking me.
So my first question for you is, why is the world in crisis and what can we do about it?
I think you know just as well as I do why the world is in crisis. We have always had, we continue to have an economic system which is based on perpetual expansion, principally, of course, for the last 150 years anyway, exploiting fossil fuels, where the success or failure of governments, economic policies, changing governmental elections, whether that happens or not, depends as much as anything else on whether something called real GDP is increasing or not, or how quickly it's increasing over time. So everything is based on expanding the scale of our economic activity, which continues to have the effect of increasing our ecological footprint on the planet. And that didn't matter so much 100 years ago, because although our activities could have devastating ecological consequences in local areas of the planet, it's not until the last 50 years that our footprint has been so big that we're eating into our global natural capital, as I'm sure your listeners know. That despite 30 odd years of IPCC reports and conferences of the parties, continues to be the case. I know that you've interviewed a lot of people on this podcast, so lots of people have explained about the planetary boundaries and how we are outside now at least 6 and soon probably 8 of the 9 planetary boundaries, which Jacob Rockstrom and Will Steffen and others identified about 15 years ago. Or if you want to use the approach of the Global Footprint Network, where they basically aggregate our impact on the planet to a single statistic, we've been using up more than one Earth's worth of resources, creating more than one Earth's worth of waste for about 55 years now. At the moment, we're not really taking seriously the need to stop doing that, because the discussion is all about green growth. It's about decarbonising economic growth and going on as before. Environmental economists talk about optimal carbon taxes or using emissions trading schemes to get the right price for a ton of carbon dioxide. That if that happens, then what we consume will change, patterns of production will change, technology will evolve over time, and we'll be able to continue growing as before, ever and ever and ever, or forever and ever and ever. And as ecological economists have been saying for many years, not that I classify myself as one of those, but that's just not realistic. It's not going to happen. We actually have to start thinking, particularly in the global north, about adequacy rather than growth, about how we distribute what it is we produce and how that contributes to human well-being, rather than feeding a psychology where everybody is supposed to be clamouring for more and more and more as the years go by.
Great.
So that's why we're in crisis.
That's why the world is in crisis, and moving to an economic system that certainly in the global north is rooted in adequacy rather than growth would be part of the solution.
Well, yes, I think that's obvious to anyone who takes this seriously. So I'm sure it's obvious to you. Actually, going about doing that is a difficult thing to do, because we've had one version or another of the system we live with now, probably for 500 years, but we've had a particularly destructive version of it for the last 40 to 50 years, and for many people they've never yet been exposed or barely been exposed to anything except the conventional narrative where the economy has to keep growing over time, otherwise there'll be a recession, otherwise there'll be rising unemployment, and politicians, even green politicians, even people who are leaders of the Green Party in many countries, don't feel able to stand up and say, actually, we've got a plan for a post-growth society, or perhaps even a degrowth society. It's not just about moving towards renewables, but when you look at the practicalities of that, then in the global north, we probably have to reduce our energy consumption if we're going to live sustainably, and if we're going to create ecological space for the many countries, the majority of countries around the world where people's basic needs are still not being met, to grow and have a fairer share of the world's resources.
Yeah, absolutely. And tell me then, let's get on to MMT. How does modern monetary theory fit into this? Because it's a topic that's come up a lot on the show. Haven't yet had an MMT expert on, and I was actually, funnily enough, talking about it yesterday. I was on the Eurostar, and I happened to sit next to 3 South Africans who'd been following the rugby around France, and that wasn't the right accent. And
well, I can't do it either. I come out of New Zealand if I try and do South Africa, which is deeply insulting to both countries, so I won't try.
Yeah, found that out yesterday too. And we got into the topic of absolutely everything. I mean, it was so wide-ranging, from the ecological crisis to Andrew Tate. And at one point when I was talking about, the things that need to change, one guy was like, yeah, but how are you going to fund it? How are you going to fund it? And I was like, well, there's this thing called MMT. And then I had to stop because I was like, I know I know the principles, but I don't know how it works. I'm very grateful to be speaking to you the following day.
Well, it's nice that you should ask me. I am what Friedrich Hayek used to call a second-hand dealer in ideas. So I'm not one of the originators of MMT. There is a movie that's coming out in the next month, initially in the US, but I'm sure will spread around the world, called Finding the Money, which features the people that have developed modern monetary theory, people like Stephanie Kelton and Warren Mosler and Randall Wray and others. They transform my view of money and finance and macroeconomics. In the 80s and 90s, I have to confess that I trained lots of bankers in London. I was a mainstream or neoclassical economist, and it took me a long time to accept that my view of the way that monetary systems work was wrong, and I needed to rethink it. MMT was important there. It's about the same time, actually, that I started to take ecological issues seriously and started to question that side of things as well. Since then, for the last 10 to 15 years, I've spent my time talking to ecologists about money and saying we're not going to shift away from the use of some kind of monetary system in the future. So you need to understand how monetary systems work. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to achieve what you want to achieve, and you'll fall for fallacies like we can't afford to have a rapid transition to renewables, or you'll fall for other myths like we need to keep the coal mines open in countries like Australia so we can tax the coal billionaires to pay for all the things we need, both of which are complete myths, utter nonsense. But if you have a conventional view of money, then you're going to fall for those myths. And then at the same time, modern monetary theory, when it was first developed in the 1990s, I guess it's the first serious challenge to mainstream macroeconomics for 70 years. It looked to a lot of people like just a more efficient way of growing the economy faster, which is not something that I would be all that interested in if that's what it was. That isn't what it is. MMT is like an instruction manual for how to use monetary systems and for explaining that governments in some countries have much more space when it comes to acting or more ability to act than in others, depending on the nature of the monetary system. Ecological economics, or having an ecological perspective, if we were talking about MMT being perhaps not a good analogy, Stephanie used it recently, being an instruction manual for a car, then ecological economics tells you where you should be driving the car, what direction we need to be going in. The most important thing about MMT, the most important thing about money that most people misunderstand or are unaware of, is the distinction between a currency issuer and a currency user. So you and I and every business we might encounter and not-for-profit organisations and even governments that don't issue their own currency, they're all currency users. Before we can spend dollars or euros or pounds, we have to go and get them. First, we have to earn the money, or we can borrow it. But if we borrow it, we've got to pay it back later. We might get into difficulty. We might end up going bankrupt as a result of that. That's true. That's true of you and me. But it's not true of governments that are currency issuers and that collect taxes that people have to pay using the currencies that those governments have issued.
So it's not true that they have to pay back the money that they issue?
Oh, absolutely not. The US government has been in deficit almost every year since 1776. Now, assuming we could possibly live that long, you and I wouldn't be able to do that. We wouldn't be able to borrow every year. The British government has been in deficit since the Bank of England was founded in 1694, many, many more times than it's been in surplus. If you look at the average of the 40 economists that the IMF classifies as advanced economies, every year going back into the past for as long as you like, on average, they run deficits. What does that mean? They spend more than they raise in taxes and other payments to governments. And actually, that's necessary most of the time because the private sector, generally speaking, wants to net save. If the private sector wants to net save, let's say we're talking about the US private sector wants to accumulate more dollars, well, the only place they can get those dollars from is the federal government. So the government deficit spends, creating the dollars which allows the private sector to net save and have what we call secure balance sheets. If you don't understand that, if you've got governments that pursue surpluses like the Australian government did in the early 2000s, you either drive the economy into a recession, and although I'm in favour of planned degrowth over the next couple of decades, that's not the same thing as an unplanned recession. Or what actually happened in Australia in the early 2000s, you get a rapid accumulation of debt in the private sector. In Australia in the early 1990s, we had a very low level of household debt compared to other high-income countries. By 2010 or 2012, we had the world's second highest household debt to GDP ratio. Because if the government's going to run a surplus, then somebody else has to run a deficit. Because in every monetary system, this is always true, deficits and surpluses cancel out. Just as for every lender, there has to be a borrower. For every surplus in the monetary system, there has to be a deficit. And if you're not talking about countries that have large, persistent balance of payments surpluses like Norway, where the rest of the world is in deficit on your monetary system, then that means if the private sector wants to habitually be in surplus to net save, then the only way to facilitate that is for governments to run deficits. And that will happen in the future as in the past. And that's not a problem because, of course, the government issues the currency. What the government needs is not your money. The government needs you to need its money so that it can spend its money into circulation. So if you want to set up a monetary system, and this was well understood in Victorian England as they conquered country after country in Africa, introduced their currency into these countries. If you, for example, are invading Ghana and you want people in Ghana to come and work for you, without actually enslaving them all, then what you do is you introduce a hut tax, a tax liability. You say to people, if you don't want us to demolish your hut, lock you in prison, you've got to pay us a tax. You're going to have to pay us a tax using these coins with Queen Victoria's head on. Oh, you don't have any coins with Queen Victoria's head on. Well, come and work for us. We'll pay you using some coins with Queen Victoria's head on, and you can pay some of them back to us in taxation. Or if you don't want to work for us, sell some goods or services to other people who do work for us. And you'll get the currency by doing that, and then you'll be able to pay your taxes. That is how you introduce a currency. You start off by imposing a tax liability on people with the power of the state behind you. That creates a demand for your currency, and you can then spend the currency into circulation. If you spend more into circulation than you tax out, which is what normally happens, well, you'll be running a deficit. You can either leave the cash in the system, or if you want to, for reasons to do with interest rate management, which we're not going to be here all night, so let's not worry about those reasons. If you want to, you can auction some government bonds, which will give people a nice rate of interest. That wasn't necessary to pay for your spending. You're the currency issuer. And it's actually to do with monetary policy and interest rate management. It's not really to do with financing the government. You can, of course, later on decide to introduce some arbitrary rules to restrict your freedom, like the debt ceiling in the US, but they're not an intrinsic part of the monetary system. They're something which Parliament or Congress has introduced and which it could just as easily scrap. So that's how monetary systems work. Now, why is that important if you are an ecological economist? It's important because what NMT says is that particularly for governments that don't promise to convert their currency into gold or into foreign currency or into anything else that they could run out of at a fixed rate, and which don't have any significant foreign currency denominated debt, because of course you can create your own currency. You can't create US dollars if you borrow those, if you're not the US government. Then you have no purely financial constraints, but you still have what we call real constraints. You are limited by the productive capacity of your economy. So your ability to transition to renewables depends on whether you've got the materials, the skills, the technology, the institutional capacity to go about doing that. If you don't, then, and if you can't import them, then at the moment you're either going to have to build up that capacity, or if you try to go ahead too quickly with those investments and you're competing with the private sector for skills or technology which is in short supply, it could be inflationary. So planning for a transition is about planning for the use of real resources to build the infrastructure of a post-growth economy which is going to allow you in time to move back within planetary boundaries. You're going to have to manage inflation risk while you do this. That might include raising taxes, but you won't be raising taxes to literally pay for government spending. That's not how it works. Actually, you spend the money into circulation before you tax some of it away. Again, it's not the taxation that funds the spending. You have to spend euros into the system, or pounds into the system, or dollars into the system before you can tax some of them away. It's about reducing the purchasing power of some people within the private sector to create room within the productive capacity of the economy to allow for the necessary public investments which you have to undertake in order to achieve your objectives. That's basically the story.
So it's okay, I need some help just with that last bit.
Yes.
It's about reducing power in the private economy.
If there's too much spending, there'll be inflation, and people don't like inflation. I mean, it's not the end of the world when the inflation rate goes up a little bit, and there's not really any great theoretical reason why governments in recent decades have tended to go for an inflation target of 2% or below, which lots of governments have. They just sort of ended up there in the early 1990s. There's nothing particularly special about 2% inflation as opposed to 5 or 6% inflation. But if we don't want inflation to go out of control, then we can't have total spending within our economy going out of control, because we have limited productive capacity. So if there's too much spending, then we'll all be competing for scarce resources, and that will drive the prices of those scarce resources up. So in order to avoid that eventuating, then if you are talking about, as we are, significantly ramping up public investment in the years to come, as we establish the infrastructure of a post-growth society with universal public services, including excellent public transport, with renewable energy and storage, replacing fossil fuels and everything else that we need to do, then we need some kind of, you can call them pay-fors if you like, but why am I taxing, why am I raising perhaps wealth taxes on rich people, although that in itself won't cut back on total spending very much, but it would create a more even distribution of income and wealth and make what we're doing more socially acceptable. Why am I introducing a series of ecological taxes? Well, in part, it's to take spending power out of the private sector to make room within the productive capacity of the economy for the government to invest without pushing the economy through its inflation barrier. But more taxes shouldn't be the first thing you think about. There are other ways of creating the space in the economy to allow for the investments we need to make. And those other ways might include actually phasing out some activities which don't contribute towards well-being at the moment in the economy. But it can also include, and indeed it ought to include, much closer regulation of private banks, if we're still going to have private banks. There used to be, until the 1970s in many countries, a series of a variety of credit controls. So the amount of lending banks did wasn't just limited by finding creditworthy people to lend to, and by the interest rate, the price of money. It was limited by central banks or banking regulators telling banks how much they were allowed to lend, how much they could expand their lending, and in what areas they could expand their lending. And we ought to have quantitative credit regulation now, influencing the direction in which banks create credit over time and limiting the total amount of credit creation. Again, to make space to allow for the public investments we need to build the future that we want to see. But the whole point is, and I appreciate it's not simple to take in at first listen, the whole point is we don't need the money of rich people to pay for things. You can close down the coal mines and the coal billionaire not be a coal billionaire anymore. And the fact that the coal billionaire isn't a coal billionaire anymore and isn't paying you taxes doesn't prevent you, it doesn't stop you from funding the investments that you need to make to build the future that you want to see. Because it isn't collect the taxes or borrow the money before you spend. If you are a government, which is a currency issuer, and which is also what we sometimes call a monetary sovereign, where you don't have the foreign currency debt and you're not on a gold standard. Instead, you spend, if you're the US government, dollars into the monetary system. Some of those dollars you tax away again. That created a demand for your currency in the first place, those tax liabilities. But the macroeconomic role of taxation is, beyond that, is to limit the spending power of the private sector so that there's room for the government to spend. And as I said, you can issue saving certificates and call them treasury bonds if you want, to provide those in the private sector that are holding the dollars that you've spent into the system and not taxed back out again with an interest rate on their savings. I'm not myself in favour of doing that. I would have a zero interest rate policy. I don't think interest rates are an effective way of controlling inflationary pressures in the economy. Instead, when you jack interest rates up, it has a bad impact on the distribution of income, because the people who receive those interest payments tend to be wealthy people, and the people that are making those interest payments tend to be less wealthy people. Mm-hmm. And in some circumstances, and the US is like this at the moment, increasing interest rates can actually boost spending in the private sector rather than cut it back. The US government has a lot of debt, and the US government deficit has been rising in recent months. And the main reason it's been rising is because US interest rates have been rising. So the US government has been paying more interest to those people in the private sector that are holding its debt on its treasury bonds. And that can act as a stimulus. It's people imagine that central banks managing interest rates is like having something like an accelerator or a brake, something really predictable. If inflation goes up a bit and you want to slow down demand, you jack interest rates up a bit, it magically brings spending under control and puts downward pressure on interest rates. It's not. The link between interest rates and total spending in the economy and inflation is a complex one, complex and multifaceted one. In Australia, we have less government debt than in the US. In Australia, mortgages at variable interest rates, whereas in the US, there are fixed interest rates. In Australia, when the central bank puts interest rates up, it's more likely to have a downward impact on total spending in the economy than in the US, because our monetary systems, our balance sheets are different. There isn't a simple relationship there. So what I'm saying is that we ought to move away from managing inflation by jacking interest rates up or down. We should be limiting the total amount of credit creation by banks through regulation, not through the use of the market mechanism, which is inherently regressive. And that credit regulation should play an important role as we are engaging in large-scale deficit spending to facilitate the investments we need, to build the infrastructure we need, to get to the point where we say, all right, we are now moving to a post-growth economy. We are going to ensure that people have a good quality of life, people have economic security, There are universal public services. There would be, if I was in charge, a federal job guarantee where people would have the opportunity, if they were involuntarily unemployed, to do work which contributed to individuals locally or society or the environment. And having done all that, I would say that as productivity continues to improve over time, then we should be moving to shorter working weeks, not longer ones. And we should be moving to a shorter working life, not a longer one as well. That's what should happen in the future as technology advances. But we're a million miles away from that at the moment.
Okay, so there are bits of this I don't quite understand. That thing, like, why do we want to limit private sector spending? And then one big stupid question, why don't governments just spend everything necessary in order to force a rapid transition?
Okay, well, in a sense, they're the same question in that we have a limited amount of labour and a limited amount of skills and limited capital equipment and technology and limited resources. So if we were to try to spend without limit, then that would just cause prices to accelerate upwards. Inflation would go out of control. And yes, you can create hyperinflation if you try to go down that route. So our ability to produce the goods and services we need is limited by our productive capacity. And that means if you get to full employment, then if at full employment you want to increase government investment further, then you need to create space in the economy to allow that to be possible. You need to free up real resources in order to allow that to be possible. And that's where you might use, for example, quantitative credit regulation to bring that about. Or you might have to put taxes up in order to bring that about. Or if you're spending more, if the government's spending more in one area, it might need to spend less in another. We can think of some areas we might like less spending. If I could give the obvious example, like military spending, although maybe that's just being a bit facetious there. But yes, we can't spend limitless amounts on everything, or we could try, but the whole system would break down. And if it didn't, then we'd be expanding the economy very rapidly anyway, and you'd need to turn back on all the coal-fired power stations again. So it wouldn't be a great idea.
Okay, but what if we? Because it's the thing, if you did shut down all the coal-fired power stations, for example, like rapidly transition them out, you would then have all of those resources, like that labor, those skill sets.
Absolutely. So I'm not advocating for big increases in taxation. I'm simply saying that if you want to move very quickly, and if inflation becomes an issue, you need to think about what's causing the inflation. It hasn't been too much spending in the last couple of years. It's been going through the four horses of the apocalypse, and then some monopolists or quasi-monopolists taking advantage of the upward pressure on the price level to build profit margins as much as anything else. Even research by the Bank of England and the European Central Bank and the Federal Reserve and the RBA in Australia, even as they've been increasing interest rates and telling us they needed to rein back on spending, their research has been telling them that the problems have been on the supply side. And of course that's obvious. I mean, it's been, first of all, directly, later on indirectly, it's been supply chains, then food prices and energy prices, and that's been very much influenced by the Ukraine war. That's put upward pressure on the price level. And of course, if you're in the UK, which I know you're not at the moment, then the disruption of Brexit added to that too. It wasn't too much spending in itself. But if you wanted to make a very rapid transition, then you could come up against the full employment ceiling of the economy, and it could be inflationary, and you then need to work out how you're going to create the space. What MNT tells you is it's not about finding the money. It's about freeing up the real resources that you need. That's where the insight comes in. And my first instinct is not to raise taxes overall. It's to look for what we call non-fiscal pay-fors. And you mentioned one of them, which is phasing out some activities. But of course, you can't phase out fossil fuels until you've got the renewable energy infrastructure in place to replace those fossil fuels. So it's not a simple problem, but it is what's the word? Empowering to know that the issue is not running out of money. That's not how the monetary system works. We know it's not how the monetary system works. I mean, if I was just to, not that your listeners will want me to talk too much about Australia, but we sort of been through a natural experiment in Australia and a number of other countries during the pandemic. I just happen to know about Australia in March 2020. Our government, our federal government, had virtually nothing in the spreadsheet cell that they refer to as their bank account at the Reserve Bank of Australia, the central bank that they own anyway. And yet they engaged in hundreds of billions of dollars of spending over the next couple of years. Now, where did those hundreds of billions of dollars come from? They didn't come from the private sector, because you can only lend to the lend in inverted commas, you can only lend Australian dollars to the Australian government by purchasing its treasury bonds, either directly if you're a bank or indirectly if you're one of the bank's customers, using bank reserve account balances at the central bank. And there was nothing in those balances either. There was next to nothing in the system. In order to facilitate the deficit spending that the Australian government engaged in, it was over $300 billion over the next couple of years, those dollars had to be created. And this just illustrates something which I often like to say to people, which is factually true. No mainstream economist can disagree with you about this, because you can then just look at how things work with them step by step. Every dollar the Australian government spends, every dollar the US federal government spends, every pound the British government spends, just to take some examples of what we regard as monetary sovereign economies. It's a little bit more complicated in the Eurozone, but it's basically the same. Every euro that the German federal government spends is a new unit of currency. When the federal government spends in the US dollars into the monetary system, those dollars are new dollars. They are the birth of a dollar. When you pay your taxes, it's lovely to feel that you're paying for something. And they even, in lots of countries, they send you a nice pie chart which tells you how much of your taxes goes to the health system or education, and it makes you feel good. But actually, that's not what happens. In Australia, every dollar that I pay in taxes to the federal government is effectively thrown in the electronic dustbin. Federal taxes destroy currency. Spending by the currency-issued government creates currency. When the government spends, they create new units of currency. When in the UK government spends, every pound they spend adds a pound to every official measure of the money supply in the UK. There are numbers on spreadsheets at the Bank of England, but they don't count. The government's balance, in inverted commas, at its central bank doesn't count as part of the official money supply in the UK. So every time the UK government spends a pound, the money supply goes up by a pound. Every pound of taxes that's paid to the UK government simply deletes a pound from the money supply. The spending comes first. Remember, the taxes come later. It's the other way around to how most people think. Once you understand this, it will change your view. I'm not talking to you as an individual, I mean people listening. It will change your view about the appropriate role for the national government to play within the monetary system, within the economy forever. And you'll never change back, because it's based on a factual description of how the monetary system actually works, instead of this notion people carry around in their heads that the government is like a household, which it isn't.
So why tax anyone anymore? Like, now that we've all been roped into a more complex monetary system, why are we still getting taxed?
Basically, for the reason I said before, which you didn't like, but I'll say it again, which is that if you just keep spending, and we know this too, because Zimbabwe tried this a few years ago. If you keep spending, and you don't tax any of it back, then eventually the spending power in the system is greater than the ability of the system to supply goods and services. There are shortages and prices get driven up faster and faster.
Right. Okay. Okay, that's finally clicked for me. Thank you. Okay. I mean, I think what's so interesting about this is that it really pegs the economy to biophysical reality, which is one of the main criticisms, obviously, of neoclassical economics. But the fact that it is about sort of available, genuine resources like materials, like labor, skills.
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah. Stephanie Kelton, when she talks about the Green New Deal, or at least I saw her do this once, and she likes to talk about a beaver building a home on a river bank, and she plays on the word bank there, but she makes the point, as you know, it doesn't have to go to an actual bank to raise money to do it. What it's using is real resources to build something, and that's what the economy is all about in the end too. Of course, we need a monetary system in order to organise ourselves, but the problem of achieving whatever we want to achieve in the next few years or the next generation economically is about the use of real resources. And of course, those real resources include, most importantly, the ecological resources on which we depend. Our economy, as we know, is a wholly owned subsidiary of our biosphere. We draw renewable resources and non-renewable resources from that biosphere, and we use energy, most of which directly or indirectly comes from outside that biosphere, because it's solar energy one way or another, even fossil fuels were solar energy once. We transform these resources to produce things which give us use value, which then eventually, or if we're talking about consumables, sometimes in a linear economy very quickly become waste. Our biosphere, as long as we don't overwhelm its waste sinks, can process that waste. And the problem that we have, of course, is that we, first of all, are overwhelming our waste sinks at the moment. But then secondly, in some respects anyway, we are using renewable resources more quickly they can be renewed. And we're using some of our non-renewables more quickly than we can develop renewable alternatives. That's why we need to scale back our economic activity in the future. But for the moment, we should be, if we're going to achieve this as quickly as we need to, for the moment, we actually need to eat in to our remaining ecological budget, because we have to use some of it up, building the infrastructure that we need to have in place in order to move to a sustainable economy. Windmills and solar panels don't come from nowhere. They have to be manufactured. And that involves using resources today. But none of this is limited by our ability to pay for it. The money is not the issue. It's the real resources that are the issue. And if anybody ever tells you on a train, how are we going to pay for a transition to renewables? The same way we pay for anything. How do currency issuing, tax collecting governments pay for things? They pass bills through Parliament. What funds government spending? A measure going through Parliament or Congress funds government spending. The problem that Liz Truss had with her insane plans a couple of years ago was that she didn't have support in Parliament. If she'd had her colleagues solidly behind her with a big majority, she could have done, it wouldn't have been a great idea. It would have held back even further. or it would have done even more ecological damage in the UK, and it would have driven an even more unequal society. But the problem was a lack of parliamentary support. So how do you fund government spending? Well, you have to win an election and pass bills through Parliament. Then it's funded. Can you run out of your own currency? No. Is it just me saying this? No, people can go online on YouTube and watch Alan Greenspan, who for years was the very right-wing chairman of the Federal Reserve, the US Central Bank, saying exactly this. What else could people look up? Well, just look up the US government's budget balance. Going back over the last century or more, they've always been in deficit. Is that a problem? No. As long as they don't do something crazy like refuse to extend their debt ceiling. Do other countries have a debt ceiling? Nowhere has a debt ceiling like the US. There's one or two countries like, I think, Denmark and the Netherlands that have something along those lines. But for the most part, no. And the debt ceiling in the US is a purely political measure that was introduced for political reasons after the First World War, and they've never got around to scrapping. But again, if you're the president and you've got support in both houses of Congress, it's never a problem to increase the debt ceiling. They've done that almost every year for the last 100 years.
Okay. Can you speak to the US dollar hegemony and the fact that so much around the world is paid for in US dollars and the impact of that on monetary systems around the world?
I can say that you don't need to be the US to have what we call a high degree of monetary sovereignty. Australia, where I live, has a high degree of monetary sovereignty. Australia is not the global monetary hegemon. The important thing is that you issue a currency, you collect taxes in that currency, you don't fix the currency to gold or any foreign currency at a fixed rate, and you don't have any significant foreign currency denominated debts. Now, it's complicated how governments around the world got into these circumstances, and much of it has happened since 1980. It's a very long story that you'd need to talk to someone like Jason Hickel or Fadil Kaboub about, but it is certainly true that for very many governments around the world, they have a difficult set of circumstances because they have been forced to or hoodwinked into accumulating a lot of US dollar denominated debt. Mm-hmm. If you have a lot of US dollar denominated debt as a government, well, you issue your own currency, but you don't issue the US dollar. You can run out of US dollars. You can go insolvent just like anybody else can. And if you've also got a lot of US dollar denominated debt in the private sector, and if you are dependent on importing necessities like food, where perhaps you were once self-sufficient in food, energy, where if you are, let's say, an African economy, we would hope in the future you'll be self-sufficient because of solar energy, but you're not at the moment. There's very little solar energy across most of Africa, bizarrely. At the moment, most of the continent is still dependent on imported oil. Even Nigeria, that's an oil exporter, imports processed oil. I mean, it's just... when you're under these circumstances, then you have a fear of floating. You don't want to float your currency, because if you float your currency rather than trying to defend a fixed exchange rate and your currency depreciates and these essential imports are priced in US dollars, in terms of your own currency, the prices of these essential imports will go through the roof. And that will have a major impact on living standards, particularly people at the bottom who are already struggling to survive, and on social and political instability. It's very difficult. It's very difficult to deal with this issue. Monetary sovereignty is something that you need to build over time, and that involves thinking about, yes, real goods again. So it involves moving towards energy sovereignty and food sovereignty. It involves somehow over time reducing the US dollar debt the government and the private sector is carrying, whether we're talking about debt forgiveness or whether we're talking about default or whatever we're talking about. So yes, all this is related, I suppose, to US dollar hegemony. But does it, from the US point of view, does it place the US in an absolutely unique position? I suppose to an extent, because monetary sovereignty is a continuum and the US is certainly at one end of it. But countries like Australia and Japan and Britain, and certainly the Eurozone collectively, and even smaller economies like New Zealand and Canada that have those characteristics as their monetary system I was describing before, don't have that US dollar debt, don't have fixed exchange rates, and they have the same kind of fiscal space that the US does. It is important that the US continues to run trade deficits while we have the system we have at the moment. Because while we have the system we have at the moment, there are many countries around the world that are desperately looking for US dollars in order to fend off insolvency and try and defend their fixed exchange rates and not end up being forced back into the arms of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and being forced to go even further down the path of austerity and privatizations and privileging global north multinationals and everything else that goes with digging an even deeper hole for themselves. And how are they going to get those US dollars? Well, outside of reparations, the only way they're going to get those US dollars without welcoming investments from US multinationals, without taking on board more US dollar debt than they've already got, is to earn those US dollars by running trade surpluses against the US. So US trade deficits certainly benefit the US. The US is going to consume goods and services which they're not producing. You won't feel that way, mind you, of course, if you are a working class person in the US who feels that you've been undercut because multinationals have moved your jobs elsewhere in the world where wages are lower, labour standards, environmental standards are lower. But from the point of view of the US as a whole, US trade deficits, which have been endemic for decades now, mean that Americans get to consume things they don't produce. And the rest of the world gets US dollars, which it is still the case, despite recent commentary that the US dollar is comfortably the world's dominant global reserve currency, and most governments around the world feel that they need to get those reserves in order to defend their fixed exchange rate and fend off insolvency. Now, this is not the future that we want to see happening, and one of my modern monetary theory colleagues, the brilliant Fadel Kaboub, who is himself Tunisian, has moved for a couple of years into Africa. He was living for a while in Addis Ababa. I'm not sure where he's living now, but he is playing a major role in trying to develop more solidarity amongst African governments when it comes to negotiating with the global north about all sorts of issues, including trade policy, fair trade, including debt forgiveness in some cases, including compensation relating to the effects of climate change, and also including developing more trade relationships between African countries, rather than having African economies trapped still in the same system they were in during colonial times, where they're basically somewhere where you get cheap minerals or cheap cash crops or cheap labour in the low value added part of manufacturing. And so they're locked into relative underdevelopment and a perpetual struggle against US dollar debt and insolvency.
Yeah.
But it doesn't matter how parlous your situation is, in one respect. Fadel and modern monetary theory economists in general would say, you can always use those real resources which you possess to try to improve people's well-being and to develop monetary sovereignty over time. So one of the ideas that Fidel pushes is, for example, using a job guarantee in order to try to move back towards food self-sufficiency.
Yeah.
That sort of thing. It's more difficult to deal with energy sovereignty because, generally speaking, there you've got to import technology if you don't have the technology at the moment or the resources. But
Yeah.
of course, Africa, like where I live in Australia, has abundant renewable energy. But there again, those same economists, they should be perhaps taking a leaf out of the OPEC book from the 1970s. And Europe has virtually none of the minerals you need in a modern economy. They all come from Africa. So how come Europe has all the bargaining power through and Europe and North America through our global multilateral bodies like the World Trade Organization, and the African economies have none? That might change in the future. None of this really has got much directly to do with money.
Doesn't it just a lot to do with power? Power and
Yes.
relationships. Gosh, I've taken so many notes. How interesting. Okay, so essentially, our monetary system is misunderstood even by the people who use it, and it's mostly used in order to, well, okay, I'm going to say this, but our monetary system, the way that it's set up and the way that it's spoken about, is essentially hiding the fact that a lot of the global north now no longer has access to those real resources that it needs in order to function as well.
Yeah, I mean, if we were talking about the monetary system, I just would, to have a simple message to leave you with, we know what sort of transitions we want to make in the future. Where are you going to find the US dollars from? Where are you going to find the euros from? Where are you going to find the pounds from? Where are we going to find the Australian dollars from? We just got been through a natural experiment, which was the pandemic. And we discovered during the pandemic that there's no problem at all finding the money if you are a currency issuing government with a high degree of monetary sovereignty. A high degree of monetary sovereignty means you have a floating currency. Ideally, you've got a resilient enough economy so that if the exchange rate fluctuates a little bit, it's not catastrophic. And you don't have any significant foreign currency denominated debt. At the moment, this is not true of many countries around the world for the reasons that we've been talking about, but it is true of those rich countries in the global north. And if we're talking in the future about big reparations, or if we're talking about the global north transferring real resources and transferring the US dollars to pay for those real resources to the global south, as we transition to a sustainable, just future economy, then the problem is a political one. People like you and me need to be in power. If we were in power, we could find the money. You just need to pass the bills through Parliament. The way our monetary systems work, our governments are not like households. They are currency issuers. There's not a problem with finding the money. The problem then will always be dealing with the risk of inflation if our demands on real productive resources were greater than the availability of those real productive resources. But the problem is not finding the money. It's never finding the money. And if people could stop talking about taxpayers' money, it's not the taxpayers' money. It's the government's money, but the government is, of course, there to represent the interests of the public. So the best way of talking about money is to call it public money. Never call it taxpayers' money. Your taxes don't pay for anything. The government doesn't need your money. The government needs you to need its money. That's why there's a tax system. If we were all to transition to using cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, as long as, let's say, the British government still calculated your tax liabilities in pounds and made you pay your taxes in pounds, there would still be a demand for the pound. Those are all facts about the monetary system.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I'm gonna have to sit with this.
Sorry, I've wandered all over the place.
No.
It's
been inordinately helpful. There's just a lot of words in it for somebody that is not au fait with money systems. My final question for you is: who would you like to platform?
Who would I like to platform? They probably don't need me to platform them, but obviously Stephanie Kelton, author of The Deficit Myth and featuring in the new movie Finding the Money. Obviously Jason Hickel, author of Less is More. Leader of the degrowth, one of the leaders of the degrowth movement, and recently one of the speakers at a big event in the European Parliament relating to degrowth. Obviously, Kate Raworth, author of Donut Economics, and let me just mention Fadel Kaboub, the Tunisian modern monetary theory and ecological economist. Have you ever spoken to Fadel?
I have interviewed Jason, Kate, and Fidel. So
there you go.
Link those episodes in the show notes. And I've had contact with Stephanie, but she's been incredibly busy. So I will try and see if perhaps her schedule is looking to free up at any point in the next 6 months to talk.
Well, I'm going to see her next week, so I'll ask her on your behalf.
Oh, could you ask her?
Yes.
Oh, that'd be great. Stephen, thank you so much for your time and expertise.
Rachel.
If you want to learn more, I've put links to everything in the description box below. Remember to subscribe to the channel if you're new here and share the episode if you enjoyed it. To support the show, subscribe at planetcritical.com, where you can read the weekly newsletter inspired by each interview. You can also become a Planet Critical patron. All links are in the description box below. As always, my deepest thanks to that community. Planet Critical wouldn't exist without your support. Thank you everyone for listening and for coming on this journey together.